Dearest participant, we are going to start today's event. We are still waiting for the Secretary General of the Red Cross, Asha, who is trying to get on, but we will start and then we will connect to her as soon as she is on. In the interest of the time, we will begin. So welcome to UN Leadership on Leaving No One Behind, with perspectives from Kenya. I'm so privileged to co-host today together with UNDP Sweden and the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation. And my name is Per Knutsson, and I'm the program director at the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation.
Per, you are breaking up.
I'm breaking up. So I will try to speak.
Medin, you may want to check your connection. I can hear Per clearly.
I was saying this is co-hosted between UNDP Sweden and Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation in a series on critical reflections to deeper the understanding of the United Nations in Sweden. And among our audience, we have a cross-section of government officials, development workers, think tanks, interested publics by invitation. So it's not the numbers, it's really the constituencies that we represent in this talk. I'm incredibly happy also, and I'd like to congratulate UNDP on the Human Development Report that was launched the 30th anniversary of the report. And it makes the leadership discussion of the UN all the more important today. 60 years ago, the second Secretary General of the United Nations, Dag Hammarskjöld, gave his life to two dimensions of leadership: courage and integrity. Integrity in terms of the values we serve, and courage for standing up for the least privileged, not the most powerful, but all of us. The issue of leaving no one behind is not an issue of noble causes. It's an issue of worthy citizenship. And the UN leadership has a unique role in bringing forward universality to that effect. And its main reason for being there is to support governments' national development priorities to be realized under the umbrella and the plan of the Global Development Goals. I am extremely pleased to today have a distinguished panel that includes Senior Advisor to the President of Kenya, Mr. Mukhtar Ogle, the Resident Coordinator of the United Nations to Kenya, Siddharth Chatterjee, who is the highest ranking UN official to Kenya, Walid Badawi, who's the UNDP Resident Representative to Kenya, Medin Sehayo, UNAIDS Country Director, Fatia Abdallah, the UNHCR representative to Kenya, and hopefully we will have Asha Mohammed, Secretary General of the Kenya Red Cross. Before I invite panelists to kick off, I will turn to my co-lead here, Kate Sullivan, who is our Strategic Planning and External Relations Manager at the Foundation, who will now share some logistical and housekeeping issues with you, and then we will go straight into debates. Over to you, Kate.
Thank you, Per. Just a quick note that this webinar is being recorded and it's going to be broadcast afterwards. So be aware that anything that you say today will be made available to the public. For participants, you'll notice that the chat function has been disabled. This is just to avoid any kind of distractions. However, if you have questions or concerns that you want to submit to us throughout discussion, we encourage you to do that in the Q&A function, which you can see down next to the chat function. And that will come to us. And even though you won't see a response, know that we're processing those and collecting them. And we'll use your questions that are submitted here during the Q&A segment. So in terms of the format of this, we'll go into introductory remarks, which Pelle will facilitate, followed by discussion. Then we'll go into question and answer. And we're grateful to everyone who submitted questions also in the registration form. We're going to address as many of these as we can, but time is limited and we had a bit of a late start. So know that if we don't get to your question, we will use these in our own work to help inform how we take this discussion forward. Thanks very much, and back to you, Pelle.
Thank you, Kate. And Kate and I will take turns. So, dear participants, this is not a BBC hard talk, but it is an honest conversation. The UN has unique roles to advance the leadership, and leaving no one behind connects today with the legacy of Dag Hammarskjöld and the key role of the United Nations. Kenya government or host governments are at the center of this plan and this challenge. So that's why I'm turning first to the senior advisor to the president of Kenya, Mr. Mukhtar Ogle. And Mukhtar, could you please reflect how leaving no one behind, the issue of marginalization, going to the furthest first, both in your government position, but in relation to the UN in particular, has changed or impacted on your leadership? Mukhtar, please, welcome.
Thank you very much. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I'm thrilled to be here among these exceptional leaders to share and to learn. Engaging with the UN in terms of my engagement as a government official has been truly enriching in the context that many of the things that we have done or I have done personally in the execution of my responsibilities are things that I have learned from my UN partners, apart from my other inborn leadership skills. Connected to this is the exceptional opportunity to not only to network, but also to look at the broader issues with a global perspective. And this is what the UN team has availed to me and to my colleagues in government. This has been a very interesting learning process. But looking at the issue of no one left behind, there are significant segments of the Kenyan population who in one way or the other feel excluded from the national conversation. And in reaching out to these groups, the UN has been catalytic and a very strong enabler in helping us push the agenda forward. In concretizing these programs, the government has established, or its policies are rooted in its national development agenda. Examining this, there's a centralized coordination to this. I hope I'm answering the question as relates to what Per is asking about, or the questions that were submitted to us. So, but this has been a learning lesson for us, if I may.
Thank you, Mukhtar. Can I please ask you to reflect a little bit, who are left behind and why?
There are different categories of people who in one way or the other are left from the national conversation, especially people from the arid and semi-arid regions that have much of climatic conditions have been inhibited from the development agenda since the colonial times and after independence. It is only now, I think in the last 7 years, that we have leveraged that capacity to reach out to these communities through the devolved form of governance that the Kenyan Constitution has availed to these excluded communities. Many others are excluded. These include young people who feel not to be part of the conversation. But exceptionally, those with disabilities, and also minority groups. There are also vulnerable segments of the population, especially those who live in the urban slums, urban poor communities, where water, food, and food security is a challenge, where issues of the Sustainable Development Goal 1 and 2 exceptionally reversed to, where the Kenya government seeks to fight not only poverty, but also ensure households do not face exceptional hunger. In this context, multiple opportunities have come and multiple challenges have exposed these vulnerable groups. But the vulnerability is also rooted in the economic livelihood of these groups. It is either political exclusion or economic exclusion over the years. But now reaching out to those is part of the government policy to avail opportunities and programs that reduces that gap, that no Kenyan feels excluded from the economic and the social development of their respective communities.
Thank you so much, Mokhtar. I will turn now to the UN Resident Coordinator in Kenya, Siddharth Chatterjee. With deepened inequality as a potential underminer of everything that we have built and constraints multiplying on sustainability of development or shared prosperity, you as the leader of a UN country team of 21 UN agencies, how are you acting differently to face the challenges and the prerogatives of leaving no one behind?
Thank you, Per. And it's always a pleasure to see you. And perhaps you've asked me that question, and you're perhaps in a much better position to answer it simply because we've had the pleasure and privilege of having you work with us here for the last 5 years. And essentially encouraging all of us to get to the furthest behind first. So you're very much part of the entire architecture of where this UN country team stands. So, what a prudent time to have this discussion, particularly with the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation, where we had a Dag Hammarskjöld who said that, when the United Nations was created, it wasn't to kind of, take humanity to heaven, but to save the world from hell. And I think in many ways, we've managed to do that collectively. But if you take a microcosm of what's happening in the Kenyan context, I would say that as a UN family, we have pushed the boundaries, the frontiers of unorthodoxy, as the Deputy Secretary General often reminds us. We've moved into places in this country, precisely the kind of places that Mukhtar was speaking about, of reaching the furthest behind, getting into some of the most marginalized counties with highest maternal mortality ratios, where we've gotten to counties which receives large number of refugees, and we have UNHCR and a group of agencies going out there making a dramatic difference. We have partners who are coming together in terms of the technical leadership of UNDP and my leadership on the socio-economic recovery plan of this country. I believe the strength of the United Nations is how it is able to use its convening, its connecting, its catalytic influence in order to reach the furthest behind. And I think the Sustainable Development Goals is really like the North Star. It's the perspective that we have in the horizon, given that we are in the midst of a COVID pandemic, which struck us like a bolt of lightning, and in that bolt, in that flash, we are seeing the contours of inequality, not just here in Kenya, but across the world, in Sweden, in the US, in perhaps the most developing parts of the world. And I think this is where the value proposition of us as a UN committee is most viable, is to be able to step into those spots of inequality, where those gaps are left behind, and make a difference there. So it's about us becoming, in this context, far more ambidextrous, being able to influence the highest levels of public policy. But at the end of the day, the boots on the ground, such as UNHCR in Kalobey or FAO fighting a locust invasion, or partners coming together in terms of transforming the frontier counties, one of the counties which Mukhtar also comes from. And today, we've seen real transformation happen. In 2014, Per, if you recall, we visited Mandera County. 36 Kenyans had just been killed by the Al-Shabaab. Highest maternal mortality ratio in the world with 3,795 deaths. per 100,000 live births. I mean, just to put that into context for the audience who are witnessing this, wartime Sierra Leone had 2,000 deaths per 100,000 live births. Today, Mandera has become a hub for facilities and healthcare for Somalis and Ethiopians who are coming across the border to seek help. So what Kenya has done is not just transformation which is happening through devolution, but the journey that they've embraced with development partners and allowed us also to work in many of these difficult places. So on multiple efforts, it is really the harmonization of development partners where Sweden has been an important and central pillar in terms of the reforms. And I can say that loudly and openly that without the support that we got, both in terms of human capital from Sweden and the resources to the RC, we've been able to make a leapfrogging change. And I really want to conclude with that. Over to you.
Thank you, Sid. And we will come back to you later on. Kate, over to you.
Thanks for that, Per. We'll turn to Walid now from UNDP. Walid, UNDP is seen as having an integrator role. Could you tell us what that means and how UNDP's approach to leaving no one behind shapes the way that it collaborates with other UN actors?
Thanks, Kate, and let me also join others in appreciating the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation for organizing this talk. And as Per was saying at the outset, I think the recent launch of the Global Human Development Report of UNDP, The Next Frontier, Human Development and the Anthropocene, I think is a celebration and a crowning moment of 30 years of human development, and the leadership that the Swedish government and Prime Minister Löfven having administrator is really very timely. So from our side as UNDP, first to recognize that. And I think it's quite relevant again to the definition of our integrator role, because as we look to development problems today, and as we look to the Sustainable Development Goals and the Agenda 2030, we realize that we can no longer address any specific development issue in isolation. COVID pandemic has been a very stark reminder of just how health is impacting poverty, is impacting all of the SDGs concurrently. So when the architects of the UN Development System Reform Resolution of May 2018, Resolution 72/279, came up with the resolution, they ascribed to UNDP this role of being an integrator, as you said, Kate. And basically, we've spent a lot of time internally to try and unpack this as an organization to see how our comparative advantage as an institution that has the broadest development perspective. We're not a sectoral agency likes of WHO dealing in health and so on. UNDP is that institution within the development system that has that breadth of mandate, that is able to look holistically at the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and look at the interplay and interrelationship among them. So when we looked at this role that was ascribed to us in the resolution and to try to put that into perspective, we identified essentially 4 areas that UNDP can mobilize the UN country teams around: policy and programming. So how do we bring integrated policy solutions around? Look at them as silofied sectoral interventions. We looked at data and analytics and how do we use our interventions around analyzing data with the vantage point of leaving no one behind, as was said earlier, to really target and pinpoint who are those most disenfranchised. The Human Development Reports that we've just launched is another contribution to put the spotlight on particular issues. And as you know, we do have global, regional, and country human development reports that have been developed over many years since 1990 to actually put the targeting of the spotlight on issues. So the data and analytics is another component of UNDP undertaking its integrator role. And then financing. So how do we look at supporting countries to cost their medium-term plans and their long-term development plans through an SDG lens. The Integrated National Financing Framework as a key example of how, following the Addis Ababa Action Agenda and the Financing for Development Summit of 2015, UNDP, leading the UN system, is working with national governments to look at costing of how to bring private, public financing, international, domestic, to actually align them to make sure that those development plans that we are working also as UNDP to support in the development are actually costed and implementable. And the fourth area that I would speak to is innovation. How do we bring and mobilize? Because the whole development system is actually working on innovations in different ways, in different sectors. So, you know, under the leadership of the resident coordinator, Sid, you know, in Kenya, and we know how Kenya is a hotbed of innovation, not just in Africa, but globally. We've actually set up the SDG Innovation and Accelerator Lab that is actually looking at harnessing solutions, and this is UNDP driving this, but bringing that comparative advantage of UNICEF, of WHO, of FAO, that all have innovation within their programs of support under an umbrella, under the leadership of the Ministry of Innovation, ICT and Youth, to unearth and bring velocity to those innovations that we're seeing. I can give you very many examples of how this has been happening over the last year or so. But just actually last week, under the Generation Unlimited agenda, where His Excellency President Kenyatta is a global youth champion, and Kenya is one of the leading countries under Gen U. The global awards to 9 young innovators were announced, and Kenya was indeed one of the winners. The Green Kenya Project Initiative was one of those 9 winners. And here again, UNDP, together with UNICEF, under the Gen U umbrella, partnered to support this Kenya Green Project Initiative. And actually, this is one example of how young people working in Matare, informal settlements, one of the most vulnerable and marginalized communities, is actually looking at a hopeful future by collecting waste to create actually energy for communities. So this is just one example, but happy to elaborate on others, Kate.
Thank you, Walid. I appreciate that. And we may come back to you in the next segment to learn more about some of those initiatives. But now I'd like to turn to UNAIDS. Medine, could you tell us a little bit about how UNAIDS is exhibiting leadership in putting the furthest behind first? And there, I'd love to hear about how you work with prevention and fighting stigma, increasing accesses to services, and how that fits within the leadership that we're talking about today.
Thank you so much, Kate. And let me also join my colleagues to thank the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation for organizing this webinar around the Leave No One Behind, which is very, very important topic of the SDG, but more so for the AIDS response. I'm sure many of you probably know the UNAIDS report in 2014 that came up with the GAP report identifying who are left behind. So for us, the people living with HIV, adolescent young girls and young women, people with disability, refugees, displaced people, prisoners, you know, there are 12 categories. So we're very much aware that this is an important area that we need to address if we want to end the AIDS epidemic. Coming to Kenya, the situation is not very different. And if you look at the adolescent girls and young women, the HIV prevalence is double among these girls between 15 to 24 comparing to the same age of males. So it's very important to really look at the data. So we are informed by data, and we have all the information who are left behind. How do we address it? I think there are a number of barriers, like as it was alluded by my colleagues earlier: geographic barrier, gender, class, socioeconomic, a number of areas, including human rights barriers to access services. So what we are doing, first of all, we bring the voice of the communities to the table in the decision-making process. When resources are allocated, we factor in who are left behind. And I want to use the example of the Global Fund that is supporting the fight against HIV, TB, and malaria. So we look at who are left behind and how do we make sure that, you know, the resources are also directed or invested on the population left behind in order to address, you know, the stigma, the discrimination, the awareness, the access to services, and so on. So that way, and empowering communities. So when we look at the service provision, you know, we are trying to break the provider, you know, receiver model. So community-led interventions are also important, that need to be financed, resourced, and empowered so that they can address even the stigma and discrimination. When we look at the number of new infections that are happening in Kenya, about 42% of the total new infection in the country are occurring among adolescent and young people. So this is very important to note. And that's why, you know, we are talking about who are left behind and how do we address, you know, the population left behind. So giving the opportunity for the young people to organize themselves, to articulate the issues that they are facing in order to address the stigma, discrimination, and also accessing, you know, services like sexual reproductive health rights and, you know, related issues. If we look at the unintended pregnancies or teenage pregnancies just during the COVID period, we have seen about 33%. There was a report recently launched last week by UNICEF in collaboration with Homa Bay County, where they came up with 33% of unintended teenage pregnancy. We can all understand what this means, how that is affecting adolescent girls and young women, not only the pregnancy, but also the number of new infection, about 13%. So I think these are the population left behind that we are trying to prioritize, organize for them to articulate their own issue, supporting them so that there are community-led intervention that address, you know, the barriers in order to access services. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And here you've already highlighted, as have your colleagues, some of the different layers of exclusion. We talk about gender, we talk about HIV status, we talk about also, several have mentioned refugees. And I think that's a good segue to look now at UNHCR. Fatia, could you share a little bit about this particularly vulnerable group, not just in Kenya, but around the world? We understand that refugees are in a unique position and that they need to be prioritized. How does UNHCR work to prioritize their needs and interests? And then also considering what Medine and others have said about subgroups within refugees, how you approach putting their needs first. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate. Thanks, Per, and my colleagues here and the government representative on this forum. I really appreciate, first of all, as my colleagues has also mentioned, the foundation, but also the support of the Swedish government. You gave us, you know, the unearmarked funding, which give us the flexibility to respond to specific needs for refugees. As you know, this week, UNHCR has marked 70 years of its existence, and that is quite a long time. We wish we had, you know, nothing to do, and refugees do not exist, and everyone is at home. But unfortunately, this is not the case. Today, as end of 2019, there are about 80 million people globally being forcibly displaced. 26 million of them are refugees. And as you know, UNHCR deals with protection, with assistance for refugees, but as well as for solution. And I will speak about that a little bit later. Here in Kenya, UNHCR work with the government, work with our colleague here in this forum very closely, because we cannot do it alone. And leaving no one behind gave us a chance to work together, and together in a greater partnership we never had it before. So I really appreciate this discussion, because it is a reflection, but it's also a reality check what we're doing together and on ground. Now, for UNHCR, as you know, how we do our programming, first of all, each year, at the beginning of the year, we assess the needs. And those needs of refugees, we're living with them. If you visualize my colleagues in Kakuma and Dadaab, In Kenya, we have about 500,000 refugees. Majority lives in these 2 camps. They live there for 30 years. And here, let me appreciate the government of Kenya because they hosted refugees for 3 decades. And solution for them to go back to South Sudan or Somalia is not yet there. So voluntary repatriation is ongoing, but not really the optimum where people could go and those camps are empty. So what I'm trying to say, we sit there with these refugees every time. If you visualize my colleagues, as I just mentioned, every day they will leave their houses or the compound and go and see what is happening in the camp. They will meet women, they will meet young people, they go to the classroom and see a teacher, how she's teaching with the kids, and what the kids were telling us about education, for example. So we live with them, we observe their needs, but systematically, we assess these needs through monitoring, through reporting, and then we listen to them and we see their interests and put it in our program. And then we deliver those programs based on the needs, based on their interests. As Medin and Walid and the RC mentioned, there are groups that need special attention. Those could be women with specific needs. It could be people with chronic illnesses. It could be children who left out of the school. It could be girls, for example, who are not accessing education or dropped because of cultural issues or economic issues. In my work around the world, when I sit with young women, they always tell me, we want education. And therefore, education is a priority in our programming. So those needs, again, we assess, we listen to them, we bring them on board, and then we implement them. Leaving no one behind also means inclusion. And UNHCR has launched the Global Compact on Refugees. It is in line with the SDGs. It is in line with the Development Cooperation Framework. It is in line helping government who host refugees for many years to share the responsibility with them by the international community. It also provides refugees with the skills. When they go home, then they were able to contribute and have their livelihood set, and their return will be sustainable. I will end by the COVID has taught us quite a lot. And I think refugees, we show, they show their resilience, but not only their resilience, their active participation on how they respond to the pandemic. We have refugees who are artists, some of them are filmmakers, some of them are communicators, and we have refugees win awards because they have art, or they produce masks, or they produce soap. Now, in this whole, program of ours and collectively at the UN, we do not leave the communities hosting refugees behind. So our program is a whole society approach, is a whole area approach, and trying to assist those communities hosted refugees as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Fatia, and thank you for reminding us of the agency of the communities who we identify as vulnerable and needing special assistance. So often we talk about the challenges we face without referring to the power that they have also to be involved in their own development and take us all forward. So thank you for that. I'd like to turn now to Asha from the Kenya Red Cross to learn a bit about how implementing partners and civil society organizations are working with the UN to address humanitarian concerns in Kenya, and how that type of collaboration is helping to address those most at risk of being left behind. Asha, we'd like to hear a bit more about your experience as a civil society organization working in the humanitarian space. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and Kate, and I just want to also appreciate the organizers of the webinar for also having me on the panel, and also appreciate the other colleagues who have spoken before me. I think the beauty of coming last is that a lot of what I would have said has already been said, but all in all, yes, I think for Kenya Red Cross in particular, we sit in a special position because we are also auxiliary to government. And this also provides us another level of opportunity to be able to participate in a lot of these issues Maybe just to also start by thanking SEED as the UN resident coordinator, and the colleagues that are also on this panel, Medin and Fatih here, that we work with very closely, and some of the other agencies that are not here, because I think maybe the case for Kenya could be different, maybe as I could hear from some of my other Red Cross colleagues in other countries. I think we have a very good platform in Kenya in terms of the engagement of civil society. And that is really thanks to the leadership of the UN and all the heads of the UN agencies in Kenya, because I think a lot of times it is seen that the UN is only working with government and is only supporting government. And a lot of civil society organizations would feel sort of left out in this equation. But I think in Kenya, we have had a different experience, and that's why I really want to laud my colleagues to say that I think the trust and the confidence that has been built with civil society organizations makes a lot of difference in terms of how we engage and how we can contribute. So there are different ways in terms of how we have this engagement and can contribute. First of all, there are several coordinating platforms where civil society engage, and in particular, I can mention the Kenya Humanitarian Partnership Team Forum, which I think for me has really been, the foundation of a lot of this engagement, and this is an opportunity where not just civil society and the UN, but also government is represented, and we are able to tackle humanitarian issues, especially even when we have, large emergencies, and quickly can gather all the stakeholders together and make decisions and act together. So I think this coordination platform is very important, and something that for us has been a good experience, and one that we would encourage to continue and be strengthened. We also have the SDG platform that also involves and brings on board many other stakeholders, including private sector, because I think sometimes we also forget that the private sector has a big role to play. And so this is very useful. But further on, as civil society organizations, of course, there is the opportunity then to be executing or implementing partners. For example, we work very, very closely with UNHCR in the refugee camp. We work also with UNICEF. We work with WFP, we work with IOM, so very, very closely in terms of the actual delivery of the services. Civil society organizations are also involved in the design and implementation of these programs, and I think COVID is also another one that we can use on the, as a good example that we were able to come together as civil society organizations together with the UN to look at what the issues were, and also collectively then identify the gaps, which then of course informed then the appeals or the plans that went out. So that collaboration again is very key. I think the other issue for me is really on data, and maybe a very important area that maybe sometimes we really don't talk about. And we know that in the last period of the MDGs, that was also one of the, the issues that was identified as a big gap. And I think going forward, and so far, we see that a lot of civil society organizations are taking the issue of data management, data collection very, very seriously. And I think there is an opportunity here to engage very closely to ensure then that we are able really to report adequately on the successes and the indicators that are put out. The question of accountability, I think civil society organizations also bring the voice of the poorest, because for many of us, we work really at community level. And so we can be able to actually bring some of these issues on the table, and are able then to be able to, in a way, confirm an accountability in terms of the people that are reached. I know, Kate, it's a bit challenging sometimes when we talk about leaving no one behind. And a lot of times, in trying to accelerate and reach some of these goals, it's very easy, I know, to sort of rush with some of the groups that are very easily noticeable. But within those, and I think many of the colleagues have already mentioned, there are also some groups that are not easy to reach. In Kenya today, I think Sid talked about Mandera in Northeast Kenya. I mean, we have communities that are living in the borders, that are living under insecurity, and not many organizations actually can reach this particular group of people. So who are the, how do we then ensure that we identify these groups and actually contribute to ensuring that they are not left behind? Because there is a risk that we can move on very quickly wanting to achieve, for example, the SDGs, but leaving a lot of these people behind. Metin has talked about some of the communities that are supported through the Global Fund and other partners. I mean, groups of people that would not ordinarily be reached through different services. So I think there's a lot that I can say in terms of how civil society organizations are working with the UN, but maybe just to share those as we continue with the discussions. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you so much, Asha, and for giving those concrete examples of platforms for collaboration and highlighting some of the comparative advantages between the UN and civil society partners, as well as the dimension of accountability that civil society helps to bring. And I think on the issue of access is something that we can take up in the next segment, which Per is going to facilitate, which will be a conversation. Before we move into that, I'd just like to highlight also that it's not just the foundation who's co-hosting this. We're very grateful for the kind words, but we're co-hosting this together with UNDP Sweden, and we're very thankful for that opportunity. So over to you, Per.
Thank you so much, Kate. And I would also like to underline that the reason why we feel that this co-creation with UNDP Sweden is both relevant and strategic is because of UNDP's integrator role. And the way that integrator role is played out is evident by us convening all of you and not just UNDP. Several of you have mentioned that this is a job that cannot be done by one person or one mandate or one agency. And that's why the reform has given the coordinated empowerment to the RC, but it's great to hear the Secretary General of the Red Cross speaking to the close and integrated collaboration with the UN family to reach those furthest behind. So please, participants, if you don't get time to have your question posed at this, I want to reiterate, we are going to bring this both to the UN country team in Kenya and into our continued work. But let's now go to the second segment of this conversation. We have heard now that leaving no one behind leadership includes changing the mindset and changing the way we work. And there that Sid spoke to that in the beginning. Walid, UNDP spoke about the importance of integrating policy and looking at institutional building and governance structures across mandates in order to build the fabric underpinning socioeconomic transformation in areas most left behind. We have also heard the value of working with integrated programming from UNHCR and FATIA, whereby you bring together the interest of the host community to refugees together with the refugees. And indeed, I would like to say the SDGs are making all countries developing countries, and Sweden itself has problems and challenges with integration. So this is not just a model in Kenya, these are models that we need to learn from worldwide. And Edin, you speak to the empowerment coming out of attacking stigma, not to confine ourselves in fright for what is the unknown, but to release people in their full potential. And Red Cross, we are really getting it, that being part of the fabric on the ground, you build resilience and you are able to connect the different mandates and the contributions of the UN in direct contact with population. Now, coming back to the government, Mukhtar, you spoke to who is left behind, and several of you have addressed populations in the arid lands. And indeed, if I may reflect that if you look at resource distribution in Kenya during colonial days, post-colonial days. And also on aid budgets, we see that the majority of resources have gone into where resources already exist. And north of the railway, if you know the Kenyan map, you have at least 10 counties that through all these processes have not been perhaps deliberately ignored, but the fact remains: vulnerability, inequality, radicalization, forced migration, and trafficking problem has grown as an effect of deepened poverty. Now, the integrated program of the UN towards this region that many of you have spoken to now is entrenched in the state policy now. I have seen that on the ASAL state policy. What would you say, Mukhtar, that the UN as that catalyst and convening body should do to advance this work and to bring about resilience and socioeconomic transformation, leaving no one behind? Sorry for the many words, but please be brief despite that.
Mukhtar, you're muted right now, if you don't mind unmuting.
Sorry. Most of the things that we have said are rooted in the changing geopolitical conditions. And I think contextually, country assessments, I think for Kenya, both at the national and the county government, you must realize Kenya is a middle level income country. So one of the things the UN does is helping amplifying the strategic one UN approach in harnessing resources and experience and capabilities to build capacity and enhance a robust coalition between partners, both government, civil society, and the private sector. At the state and the county level delivery programs, where we really focus on how to establish a joint program for coalescing around, development agenda to overcome many of these constraints, particularly for these vulnerable counties and communities. What the UN does, and I think it can do better, is in terms of programmatic interventions, which are robustly captured both by Fathia and Aisha of the Red Cross and also Walid. It's strengthening, system institutions to help the government achieve its middle term, programs, especially in the Big Four agenda. Also looking at the issues of AIDS and community education in terms of literacy and supporting multiple issues. But I think, to be fair, there are multiple challenges to this, because we need to critically examine the deepening level of extreme poverty and inequality within the paradox of shared prosperity in these communities. That's not something we can just ignore. More importantly, I think of the current situation, I think there are challenges of socio-political tensions. It's not peculiar to Kenya, but I think it's the whole of Africa, in terms of issues pertaining to dispensing justice and the appropriate allocation of resources and the accountable deployment of those resources, which is, I think, the hallmark of good governance. Nonetheless, there are challenges of community peace building and resilience for these struggling communities on issues of security. Then this takes me to the one issue where the UN has been very critical, and I think is more critical this time in history, is in the issue of elections management and electoral justice for having the right leadership. I don't think in Kenya, and I think many of the colleagues in the country agree with me, the institution that is mandated with the elections is prepared for the elections now as we speak. It is not only dysfunctional, but I think the expectation is exceptionally, I think, below par as we progress and we approach the elections. One challenge we have now is the UNDP and the UN agencies have been, particularly the UNDP has been very critical, and I think we need to amplify those voices as a critical area of engagement. But one particular area, I think, without fear of any doubt, is that there is a shrinking space for civil society. either in their dalliance with government or their fear of repercussions. I think one singular effort we can do now in terms of community mobilization and organizing for peaceful elections is to strengthen the institutional capacity of civil society groups, especially in matters of electoral justice, and ensure there is sustainable, well-coordinated, robust and innovative engagement both with government and with struggling communities. The pushback some of these civil society groups face, especially for resurgent women leadership, against deeply entrenched cultural ethos and traditions, is not only urgent, very urgent, but very important in going forward. The other challenge, I think, for some of these struggling communities in the context of none is left behind in building a very just, cohesive, and inclusive society is the issue of climate change. And I think Aisha talked about this at length in terms of climate mitigation and climate action as it relates to, I think, Sustainable Development Goal 13 in the area of water, agriculture, and energy. This also takes me to the issues of security and community resilience. Some of these communities where Sid, Walid, and the pair have talked about are vulnerable to these conflicts. Unless there's a coordinated effort between government, the UN agencies, civil society, and private sector, I think some of our conversations will remain a talk show. And doing this, there's need for a more compelling and a strategic focus on how we can drive some of these, envisaged, ambitious programs with speed, efficiency, and effectiveness, as well as improving the tracking of these interventions and investment, both at national and county governments. So that accountable process for monitoring and reporting also, I think, is very crucial. But I must say, government is very receptive and supportive of its partners. But again, a lot can be done together. Thank you.
Thank you, Mukhtar. Fatia, now you kindly acknowledged Sweden for putting forward flexible resources, enabling you to do transformational work and not limiting you to traditional work. I would like you to elaborate a little bit on that, not on Sweden, but the expectations on UN's leadership together with the behavior of UN member states and donors. How can that be a reinforcing relationship for transformational efforts, leaving no one behind? If you would like to speak to that.
Thank you so much, Per, for this very important question and very timely. I think as UNHCR, our job become much easier. I mean, when I listen to Sid leading the UN in Kenya, and he speaks about refugees, my advocacy on that become less. So the focus and the direction become clearer to all of us. And the donors have come along to support us. I just want to give one example, which is a Kalube settlement example. And this is part of the Kakuma refugee camp. Here, whom do you have there? We have refugees and we have host community. We have UN agencies coming together. We have the NGOs, as Aisha has just mentioned. There we have the leadership of the government on ground and here at the capital. We have UNDP with us as well on the development. There we want to make a difference, and a difference in people's lives. And it's not about humanitarian. This is about humanitarian and development nexus. And I think this one really is something we need to advance. We need to scale up and accelerate because we see the difference it's making in people's life. And there, Kalube example brought the private sector, brought the donors, brought the UN and the government together, and the community mobilizing them to be part of it, and the civil society as well. There, it is about economic inclusion. people, refugees, they can be economically sound and they can provide economic opportunities to them and to the other. The host communities are the people there who needed this development more than anyone else. And these two communities together, they come together with the support of everyone and project become vibrant, which is about shelter or renewable energy or education or digital. It is fantastic, really. We have the GIZ, for example, working on renewable energy. We had Vodafone and Muhammad Salah leading the digital education for girls and for boys there. And we had UK, for example, with us. We took the teacher, the winner from Kenya, who went there and inspired the teachers and the students. So there is a lot of opportunity for solution. And I think this is the point. Refugees need solution, not only humanitarian. And therefore the nexus and development is very, very important to put this together and bring everyone on board. Indeed, with the donors' flexible funding, we will be able to do quite a lot. And the COVID here is an example how we're going to go beyond now the COVID impact and be able to bring people back to their resilience, and then they move forward. So there's no other time than bringing us together in a greater partnership for solution and not only humanitarian. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fatia, and thank you for bringing up beyond COVID leadership, and I will come back to that, to the resident coordinator in a short while. I would like to turn to Medine and actually address the multiplying impact of COVID to address populations that are already under strain, and not only populations but individuals. And I know that within the joint efforts of the UN and the focus on marginalized groups through the leadership of the RC, traditional camps enforcing harmful practices have signed up to end child marriages. The president has spoken to ask the UN to help end genital mutilation. Now, you work with sexual reproductive health. You work with girls and boys that during COVID are confined to home spaces. They are perhaps isolated and with less opportunities digitally to reach out. How has UNAIDS or the UN family switched on to the situation to do as much as possible to reach the most vulnerable?
Yeah, thank you so much, Per, once again for this important question. Yeah, as you rightly said, right now we are basically dealing with two pandemics. We have COVID and we have the unfinished agenda on HIV that is affecting the most vulnerable population. So I think we can learn from the experience of the AIDS response in the last 4 decades, how we have been really dealing with most vulnerable population. Yes, HIV on one hand, and now the additional pandemic, COVID that posed, that has really confined, people to stay at home, especially now that the schools have been closed, children were staying at home. There is a lot related to mental health issues and a number of challenges with the loss of livelihood as well, whether food insecurity, malnutrition, and a number of those issues. So I think the sexual reproductive health, when I used the example before, like almost 33% of young girls, became pregnant, unintended, obviously. So that is basically due to lack of access to sexual reproductive health services. So it's very important for us to really look at, a multi-sectoral, integrated and people-centered again, focusing on the population left behind. As you said, the UNDAF, under the leadership of our resident coordinator, Sid, we have been really looking at how can we focus on people. Yes, we need to build, in institutions, but the most important thing is focusing on people. So that's why we were referring, the community aspect, the community system strengthening, empowering communities, because traditionally, as you know, there hasn't been much resource that has been channeled to these community groups to really organize themselves, identify their issues, and then bring their voices to the table where decisions are made. So I think now, when we say multi-sectoral integrated people center, that's basically about, the UN reform, and UNAIDS, since it has been created through the co-sponsorship, we have all the 11 UN agencies working together with the clear division of labor, addressing human rights issues like UNDP, sexual reproductive health with UNFPA, prevention of mother-to-child transmission with UNICEF, and I can go on. But the most important thing is, I think now that we have a shrinking, financial landscape, it's very important to talk about, efficiency and effectiveness, that we come together. We have a clear data on who is left behind, so that we deliver a very targeted kind of programs that will address the needs of the most disadvantaged people, whether geographically in terms of county or population group. So that is the way to go, and I believe this is what we have learned from the COVID response. So not only the UN entities coming together, but as Dr. Asha was mentioning, the civil society, the private sector, everyone coming together. I think we are trying our level best. There are lessons that we have learned that we need to capitalize on and then implement even post-COVID. So I want to use the example of, again, the SDG partnership platform that you are very well aware, Per, that we have, these different windows. The primary health care window is now really, making a lot of progress, attracting diverse partners coming together with innovation, with technology, to address the challenges, because we cannot expect different results if we are following the same way. So this is now the time of business unusual, so we need to really capitalize on that and then do better. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Medine. Walid, UNDP with its unique capacity helping government to build institutional resilience and governance capacity. Now, speaking about leaving no one behind, that capacity is urgently needed close to the people left behind. Are you in the right place? Where is your staff and your ideas, your leadership around that, and how do you bring or envisage to link your agency colleagues cross departments to make that capacity grow in a one UN response? Over to you, Walid.
Thanks, Per. I think let me address that, because the responsibility for delivering on the SDGs is really with the national governments, and our role as a UN is clearly to play a supportive role in terms of ensuring that the machinery, the planning, the budgeting, the whole process to enable this, or the stakeholders that colleagues have spoken about are brought together in a manner that can efficiently and effectively deliver on that. And let me maybe at the outset first just recognize the government of Kenya for its leadership in this space. We know Kenya led globally the open working group that gave birth to the Sustainable Development Goals through His Excellency Ambassador Macharia Kamau, who is now the Principal Secretary in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And so Kenya not only is looking at the implementation of the SDGs internally, but is actually given birth to this globally. And it's important to recognize that. So we are quite privileged to be in a country where the sensitization of the leadership at all levels is so attuned to what does this take to actually deliver on the SDGs. So let me just maybe go back a little bit, because if we look at what has happened in Kenya from when the 2015 the SDGs were adopted in 2015, globally, the UN system came up with a framework, and that framework is called MAPS, which stands for Mainstreaming, Acceleration, and Policy Support. And this is again part of the global leadership within the UN system to define a framework and an approach that will have some context-specific adaptability, but still bring the comparative advantage of the system. UNDP, of course, was a key actor with all of the other UN Development Group members in coming up with the MAPS framework. And Kenya was one of the very early adopters of that MAPS approach in the country. Now, MAPS really looks at, one, ensuring that the...
Sorry, Walid, can I interrupt you briefly? I think your mic on your headset may hit something hard because it's making sounds. I'm not sure. I just wanted to check. But
okay.
Sorry for interrupting.
Can you hear me now? Is it any better, or is it still begging? So we started to look at how to domesticate, nationalize this MAPS framework in a Kenya context. And that starts with really creating awareness in society around the SDGs so that governments can be held accountable for those goals. The mainstreaming of the SDGs, and as Mukhtar was talking about, the medium-term plan of the country and the Vision 2030, all of that was supported by UNDP with the country team in ensuring that the plans are responsive to the SDGs, not just at the national level. And you're speaking about the whole process of bringing that down to the 47 counties here in Kenya. There is something called the CIDP, the County Integrated Development Plans. And as part of that whole process of mainstreaming, as UNDP with UNICEF, with UN Women and other agencies, we have, through our joint devolution program, actually thanks to the government of Sweden, but also the government of Finland and Italy, who have actually enabled us to come together as UNDP, UNICEF, and UN Women to design a joint program that is actually ensuring that these county integrated development plans are actually reflecting those the SDGs very directly. So MAPS actually has been, and we've worked together with the government to develop a roadmap, and you'll remember this much more than I do, Per, because you were here when this transition roadmap from the MDGs to the SDGs was put in place that looked at holistically all of the areas that we look at to support the domestication of the SDGs. Now, I want to pick up one element of the MAPS framework, which has been touched on by many of the speakers, and that is institutional coordination mechanisms to implement the SDGs. And many examples were given by Dr. Aisha about the Kenya Humanitarian Partners, by Medid, by Fatiha in terms of the work with the refugee communities. But let me say here at an apex level, it is the State Department of Planning that is the custodian and the driver for that process of domesticating the SDGs. And they have been the central anchor point with whom we have been interacting throughout this whole process of landing the maps. So through that process, a technical working group was established, bringing in all of the stakeholders represented through organized structures. KEPSA, which is representing the private sector, the SDG Forum, and Dr. Aisha talked about those, the UN system, development partners, and so on, were brought together actually under the aegis of the State Department of Planning at the national level to actually start then embedding the SDGs very directly to implement. The devolution program becomes a vehicle for that. Other programs like the cross-border program that was also addressing some of the more disenfranchised communities in the FCDC and in the border counties become vehicles for us to deliver that support. So we still have a ways to go because those coordination mechanisms are not just standing at the national level. We have to bring them down to the ward level. And that's where investments through core, like from Sweden, allow us to actually operationalize such structures.
Thank you so much, Walid, and thank you for making sure that participants hear that the UN is supporting governments and not the other way around. Secondly, that leaving no one behind has to change its focus sometimes from national government policy because it has been focusing on the more resourced for a while and therefore needs to have more attention to the more marginalized population. And that's a collaboration between the UN and host governments that can only be effective if both partners are doing a good job. So I want to turn to Asha before coming back to the resident coordinator. And Dr. Mohammed, I'd like to ask you, we have actually the impression now, a picture of a quite unified response to leaving no one behind from different competence areas and different roles. I would like to ask you, do you see this change from the view of the Red Cross closest to the ground? Is this a trend that is building, giving you energy? And if so, what would you say is the biggest challenge to advance this, making those left behind reduced in numbers?
Thank you very much, Per. And yes, clearly I can say, as I mentioned earlier, that for us in Kenya, we can actually say there is a good momentum and we are at a good place. But like many other things, of course, there is still a long way to go to achieve really the goals. And therefore, it means that, yes, we need to continue and to actually scale up. And on the ground, clearly a lot of impact because of this good collaboration. But I think, as you said, yes, some challenges, which also brings me also to the other part where there are also opportunities. And maybe if I start with the opportunities, like I mentioned earlier, I think there is a good working relationship. There is trust that has been built between all the different stakeholders. So government, the UN, the civil society, and therefore already a ripe ground for really a scale up to happen, which I think is very critical, and we should be able to take advantage of this to be able to move forward. There is also some good case studies that can actually be used to scale up, and I think Fatia mentioned that very well in terms of what's going on in Turkana with the county government of Turkana and the UN agencies and all the other players that are there. And I think that's a model that maybe needs to be looked into and to study some of the success factors to then see how those can be replicated in some of the other parts of the country where actually this kind of effort is really required. So I think we have some good case to be able to build on. But of course, the challenge we have is inadequate resources. And when I talk about inadequate resources, then I mean both financial and human resources. Of course, COVID has now come back and taken the communities some steps back, which means that where we were in terms of the indicators and how much more we needed to do means that we have to build back a little bit more and try to maybe regain some of those steps, whether it is in HIV, whether it's in all the other sectors, food security included, because of also the question of other disasters that have happened together with COVID in 2020. So which means then our platform has sort of been lowered, and therefore it means that there's some work to be done. So resources are important. We know that COVID has brought some challenges and will bring some challenges, but I think it will be important to really see where the quickest wins can be made and where the gains, to ensure that, yes, no one is left behind. How do we ensure that even with the minimal resources, that those people are reached? I will maybe talk about the refugees in particular, because this is one area that we are really also concerned that if enough resources are not availed, and with the situations happening in the neighboring countries, then we will have a population that is really going to be in a difficult situation. And we will all be challenged in terms of how we ensure that we deliver services. So I think there is then need to continue to see how to, bring in more resources to support these marginalized communities. Maybe the other issue, Per, I would say, is that I know we have a lot of tools, we have a lot of frameworks, both on the UN side, the government side, and even in civil society. But I think COVID has also come to test us in terms of how agile are we as institutions. And this, for me, is also another challenge that we really need to look into, because going forward, we know this may not be the end of it. And therefore, how can we ensure that we have those systems and we have tools that are agile enough to be able to accommodate and to be able to provide us with the good foundation to be able to build on. So briefly, I could stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Asha. Now, Sid, as the resident coordinator and speaking about transformational leadership, all of you have spoken to two things to effectively attack poverty with those left most behind. One is the necessity to blend competencies, capacities, and roles and functions to actually go beyond the individual project. And Asha now brought up the other issue, which is about optimizing resources that are increasingly constrained. How have you worked in practice convening embassies, government, local government, UN agencies, civil society? Can you give the participants a picture of how does the UN take that leadership and start to make something that moves as a joint machinery against inequality and marginalization? I will begin with that question and come back to you. Sid, please.
Perhaps I'll give you two quick models. I realize that I have another meeting to soon go to. So first is, if you recall, the cross-border program that was started by my predecessor, Nardos, which really showed that what the UN is capable of, its ability to convene and connect, and its political influence, given the fact that we could actually get two heads of state at a remote part of northern Kenya and be able to actually sign an MOU to look at how do we look at these people who were desperately poor, desperately marginalized, had seen years and years of internecine conflict, be able to put a stop to that. And the transformative effect of infrastructure of that road that connected Lamu all the way to Addis Ababa in Ethiopia had such an impact. So despite the various challenges we faced along the way, it certainly went to serve an important purpose, particularly given the important role that the UN has in the prevention agenda, the prevention of conflict, the prevention of droughts and outbreaks, etc. So I thought that was a good picture. And I think the UN University of Japan analyzed it and called it a global best practice. And I think the second is the SDG platform that we set up. Again, this was to harness our ability to bring the private sector, governments, development partners, thanks to the Netherlands as one of the early starters, then Sweden and many others came on board. And what that did was allowed us to forge new types of partnerships. So when I spoke about those 6 counties in the remote parts of Kenya where maternal mortality ratios were extremely high, look at that concept of a partnership. You had UNFPA, UNICEF, and WHO coming together. We had the Kenya Red Cross as the implementing partner, simply because of our inability to actually put boots on the ground because of this insecurity that prevailed there. But at the same time, we had companies like Philips and GlaxoSmithKline and Safaricom and Huawei, Kenya Healthcare Federation and Merck joining in. Again, what it needed was the UN's ability to convene all this. We were able to bring in a little bit of catalytic financing, and now around $15 million. Look what it turned into, a $150 million juggernaut. And the transformation that has actually happened in these 6 counties was quite dramatic. So I think this is where the purpose-driven part of the UN is going to be. And for us to be fit for purpose, it means embracing the new reality that we have to be thinking very differently. Our knowledge base needs to be entirely different. Our ability to understand, comprehend from the diverse introspective aspects of economics to social behavior, to behavioral economics, bringing all that together, and yet at the same time, have a team of skill sets that are able to go and deliver at that last mile purposefully. So in being fit for purpose, the choice for us is the flow of dynamism, of a new breed of leadership that we need leading the UN agencies, funds and programs, and certainly a new breed of resident coordinators, where in today's world where we are going to see many more constraints, I think we have to be humanitarians, development experts, and solid entrepreneurs as well. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Sid. And I know you said you have an important appointment. Do you have time for one more question from my side? Thank you. So we have addressed structural poverty today and leaving no one behind from a UN system-wide approach. Now, looking at the demographic, not only in Kenya, but in the whole sub-Sahara, a segment of people risking being left behind is a youth population, our future. Now, can you say, Walid mentioned Generation Unlimited. Could you say with a few words, having good parts of your country team with you online now, what are the strategies of the UN in Kenya to address the different aspects of youth being the potential force of the future and not the cost and the problem of the future?
Maybe it is a question of demography, and I think it's very important for your audience to also understand. Let's compare Sweden and Kenya. In 1956, Sweden and Kenya had the same population, 7 million. Sweden today is 10.9 million. Kenya today is 47.6 million. By 2030, Kenya will be 65 to 70 million. By 2050, Kenya will be about 100 million. By 2050, Africa will be about 2.3 billion, of which 830 million will be young people. What does this mean? It means that with this massive youth bulge, where another statistical correlation is Sweden's median age is 47, Kenya's median age is 18, and that's by and large the median age throughout the continent. Now, it is a massive opportunity of consumers and producers for the future. However, in that comes in several aspects, unless that, and that is the vision of Generation Unlimited, and this is where the entire UN country team is united. Unless we make sure that young people are fully employed, fully educated, fully trained, we will not be able to find them the opportunities to be skillfully employed. The other part is the primacy of sexual reproductive health and right. And the difference between Sweden and Kenya was the choices the 10-year-old girl could make when she was 10, and her vision and her ambition, compared to the 10-year-old girl in Mandera, whose life is completely different, who has to face traditional harmful practices, all those things which challenge her. Now, how do we bring synchronicity to this? And I think that is why the spotlight that we have to place, particularly on adolescent health, is going to be mission critical, because this includes everything, including the knowledge that girls and women need in terms of safeguarding the primacy of sexual reproductive health and rights, and that we've seen a rollback. Even last year at the International Conference on the Population and Development, you saw so many powerful countries saying, no, we don't accept the ICPD agenda any longer. And I think this is something that we have to remain absolutely right front and center. That is going to be the final aspect about how the youth of this continent progress or go back, because economically we know we need a total fertility ratio of 2.1 to see that dramatic economic rise. If we are going to be burdened by a large number of children at the household level, there is going to be very little savings. It is, after all, savings that open up opportunities for better education, health, and all those things. So I think the approach to Generation Unlimited, or the potential of the youth, has to be much more comprehensive, much more from a cradle to grave theory rather than intermittent project-sized interventions. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Sid. Could I invite anybody of you to connect to that narrative and add to it how your agency mandates come in and build back on that youth youth-related strategic challenge of a one UN approach to youth empowerment and betterment.
Can I come in?
Yes.
Yeah.
Walid?
Yes, no, I think thanks for raising that. And I think the demographic, as Sid was mentioning, in the 2019 census, 75% of Kenya's population is below the age of 35. And so it's a significant population demographic that we can't but have to address very directly. And I spoke of Gen U as a UN-wide approach, and this has been a very robust one that has developed a very direct action plan to respond to all of those issues of youth employment, training, and education, and so on. So as UNDP, what we have done, and I'm actually quite proud of this as UNDP Kenya, is on the 26th of October, 2 days after UN Day, we launched what we call the Youth Sounding Board for UNDP Kenya. And this is a vehicle that is bringing youth leaders, youth champions, aligned to our country program priorities. It is actually co-led with the Chief Administrative Secretary of the Ministry of ICT, Youth and Innovation of Kenya, the youngest member of cabinet of the government of Kenya, to co-drive that. I don't qualify because I'm over the age of 35. So it's led actually by youth representatives in my office, but it is not just to give a seat at the table for young people. It is giving an entire table for young people. And what the Youth Sounding Board is a vehicle to do is ensuring that anything that we do as UNDP, whether it's in governance, whether it's in environment, whether it's in inclusive growth, is going to be youth-centric and youth-focused. And it's been actually quite an interesting experiment so far to see how, that kind of empowerment of young people at the decision-making table is influencing the direction of our own interventions in the country. So I just wanted to reflect on that, and that's going to be a vehicle that ensures that our programmatic responses are then driving the wider Gen U agenda in the country. Over.
Thank you so much, Walid. I will now turn to Asha from the Red Cross, and I will add to that. It's a demographic potential marginalization which is extremely expensive potentially, and not to speak in terms of voice and human rights, a potentially dismissive aspect of society leadership. Now, within that bracket of young people, individuals are connected to other youth in the world. with expanded thoughts, with individual preferences, with sexual differences. And we who are the older part of the population, we cannot just put them in place. We have to listen and change ourselves. How do you work in order to widen the space and really forge the fronts on development that we all need to fight rather than fight each other? Asha, would you like to go next?
Thank you very much, Per. Maybe I could start by saying that we of course have the demographics of Kenya, as has been mentioned by the previous speakers, in terms of being almost more than 70% young people. But when we look at the Kenya Red Cross in particular, actually, you know, the majority of what we do is actually carried out by volunteers. At the moment, we are talking about 200,000 volunteers, and 80% of them are young people. So basically, the Kenya Red Cross would not be what it is without the young people. So for us, they are a very important part of the organization. They are the organization because they are the ones who are the human resource that actually delivers the services to the most vulnerable in our case. So for us, looking at those two dynamics, we definitely then put youth as a key priority, and we are actually concluding a new strategy which starts next year, where, you know, apart from many other goals, the youth pillar actually stands on its own as a very clear priority for the organization. So we look at the Kenya Red Cross as a place where two things can happen. One is where young people can come and serve their community. And secondly, a place where they can come and have their capacity built for them to be able to also be able to have livelihoods for themselves, because they cannot only just continue to be volunteers, but they need to be able to be empowered. And we know that, you know, with the, you know, high rate of unemployment in this country, compounded now with COVID and lack of education for many young people, this is increasingly going to be an issue. So I think an open dialogue with young people is critical. And I think we had an opportunity. COVID has brought a lot of challenges, but there have been also some opportunities where it has been a time where young people actually could come together and have a lot of conversations. Intergenerational dialogue, where then, you know, the different generations could come together and discuss issues to be able to understand each other better. Because again, as many people will fear that, yes, with the demographics, then it means you have also a big group of the population that is unhappy and that feels that they do not have enough opportunities. So what is it that we can all do together? If I look even, for example, the work that we do with many of the UN agencies, the government and other stakeholders, a lot of the indicators actually still, we find that the young people are the most affected. So when you talk about, you know, HIV, we are talking about adolescent girls and young women as really being in the forefront of the infection. And therefore, it means that if we cannot address this particular group of people or this part of our population, then we will really not be able to achieve the gains. Today, we talk about mental health and psychosocial support that we and many others are extending because of COVID. Then young people are very much affected. They've been out of school since March this year. So many things have happened. I think Medin talked about the teenage pregnancies. So a lot of issues. So both as a human resource to deliver service to communities, but also as a group that has been really affected over time, I think there is no way we can have programs that do not put the youth at the center. Thank you.
I should know by now how to unmute myself. Thank you so much, Asha. Sid spoke about a shrinking space, and I'd like to turn to Medin here. We know that marginalization comes in many forms, but it's driven by fright for the unknown as a common denominator. And ethnic identity could be at the fore of marginalization. sexual identity could be the same. Disability could be, and indeed, gender equality has shown that we are not yet there, but more than half the population of the world has been ignored. So in that space, not comparing one to the other, but acknowledging that we have to constantly work with opening up the space. And if we go back to the UN, the charter begins with "we the people." Regardless of how we are born, we are worthy citizens. So coming back to bold leadership, Medin, when you wake up in the morning, what are the things that you have to deal with in order to enlarge that space for young people? Over to you.
Thank you so much, Per. I think this is very important question and very much related to the concept of leave no one behind. So as I was alluding to the 2014, GAP report that identified, the population left behind. I think one of the key challenges that we have, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, and that also impedes the access to services is the judgment, like, whether religious values or how our constitutions have been, crafted, decades ago. And that is now becoming a big challenge, because when we look at the key population, for example, when we say key population, it's sex workers, and the HIV prevalence among sex workers is, much higher than the general population, sometimes up to 30%. We have the MSM, and then, the adolescent young people who cannot really make decision, for their own rights. So I think these are the key challenges that we are dealing with. But again, since countries have really signed up to the SDG, meaning people-centered human right approach and providing, opportunities and access, to everyone, regardless of their sexual orientation or their gender identity. So that's not really an easy area, but I think we need to work on by providing data, because if I'm saying like 30% of the new infections are coming from this, marginalized group of population, then there is no way that, we aim to end the AIDS epidemic within the SDG framework. So these are some of the challenges that we are dealing with to make sure that people, have access to services. That is really the bottom line. And that's how we can also address, the leave no one behind. One thing that, taking this opportunity, you raised it earlier, the FGM, for example, so we are deciding really on the fate of that young girl. So that has got a number of implications, health-wise, psychologically, and the opportunities that the girl should have. So His Excellency, the President of the Republic, President Kenyatta, is committed and is really championing, to end female genital mutilation, which is really, a part of now addressing those taboos. So even some of the taboos can be addressed, in the way now we are trying to, eliminate FGM. So I'm hoping that a country like Kenya will still be leading and opening the space to empower young people so that they can exercise their sexual reproductive health rights, and also access to services to ending the AIDS epidemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Medin. And I will actually make an attempt to start wrapping up this conversation. And I started by saying that we were going to have an honest conversation. And indeed, I think that participants have been part of a very generous and open conversation. I know personally how difficult it is to operate sometimes in that leadership space that you have shared with us. What is important for everyone is to get feedback that although the world is not perfect, the UN country team in Kenya is making that effort and changing its collective leadership to respond to member states' expectations and the Secretary General call for transformational development, focusing on those furthest left behind. And that will, of course, take time. What you have presented to us has included from the government side how national policies, including the Constitution and the Vision 2030, is increasingly paying attention and acknowledging that population groups are indeed left behind and that shared prosperity will not come above unless directed efforts are being done. We have also heard from you as a composition of senior leaders, both within a UN country team of different mandates, different agencies, and civil society in collaboration, that roles and functions need to be blended for policies, legislation, regulations to come together with empowerment, changing norms and standards in view of the global values that we all are there to respect. But we have also heard from you that in this journey, you are expanding the partnerships from the donors to talking much more about government, about local government, about private sector, about the innovative minds of youth, and rather looking at the UN as a catalyst and donors as critical partners. And in that transformational change, we have also touched upon the necessity for resources to follow transformational and integrated programming. We can no longer do the quick fixes and the short-term results by donating funds for an individual activity when socioeconomic transformation demands a multiple response or an interdisciplinary response. And you have also spoken to very important aspects of the UN Charter in terms of translating what we the people and the common denominator of human rights actually means in development. It does not only mean to identify a refugee as a full-worthy citizen. It also needs to identify that a host community receiving that refugee may be as poor, that the children on both sides need each other, and that programming must be reinforcing to be effectful and sustainable in the long term. Participants have been writing into us, and some of the questions that have come in, we have tried to integrate in the prompting questions that I have put. They have been on triple nexus. They have been on institutional capacity building and so forth. And we will share the full range of those questions to you as feedback so that you can have them both as encouragement and as a challenge going forward. Together with UNDP Sweden, we hope that this type of dialogue going down to the country, but going across partners and going across functions will be something we will try again in other regions. It is not about bringing out a contextual specificity. It is about looking at global objectives and global goals being realized where people live. And therefore, your experience and your efforts as leaders is so important. And we will come back to challenge you to do more, despite the fact that it's very difficult to be as leaders in the situation you are in. I thank you so much for participating, and I'm going to leave it to Kate now for some housekeeping issues. And I convey my or Mukhtar's regard, because he was called off 10 minutes ago by the presidency. So he asked me to say thank you as well. Warmly thank you from us, both Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation and UNDP Sweden. Over to you, Kate.
Thanks, Per. Just a quick note that in the chat box, you will find a survey. We'd be very grateful for your feedback. So we'll leave this event open for a few moments for those of you who are still here to take the opportunity to fill in those questions quickly. And thanks again from our side.